But there are other equally dangerous and drastic therapies being used. One of them that came to prominence during the 1960s because of the scandal that occurred at the Chelmsford Hospital, where Bailey had been using these methods, and many patients had died from them. One of these methods was using coma or deep sleep treatment to treat schizophrenia. And again, I'll keep reiterating this, the basis on which this therapy was developed was deeply speculative indeed. It was Manfred Sakel who was responsible for developing insulin therapy. He has been carrying out trials on junkies, people addicted to opium and morphine, things like that. And he felt that maybe a solution was to put them to sleep so they could get over their addiction without the stress of going cold turkey. And he used an insulin-induced hypoglycemic coma to achieve this. And it seemed to have a great deal of benefit in terms of curing the junkies. He then thought, well, maybe we could do the same thing for the restless, agitated schizophrenics. Now, that condition of withdrawing from heroin or whatever does involve psychotic states. And he felt that if in junkies the artificial psychosis that resulted from withdrawal, if this condition ameliorated that, then maybe it would work with schizophrenics. So he decides to trial the method upon schizophrenics. And this was what a colleague said: the personality of the patient can often be changed so entirely that it seems as though the treatment has created a new being. And Sakel has his range of claims, the claims that we see time and time again. But notice the size of the sample here. Full remission in 70% of cases. Social remission in 18% of cases. Now, because Sakel was Jewish, Vienna, the Greater Germany area, was not a good place to be for Jewish people in the mid-1930s. And many Jews from Vienna moved to the USA. And Sakel was no exception to this. Got out in time, took his expertise to the USA. And he takes this therapy with him. Initially, it's rejected by the American psychiatrists, but his technique was adopted in Switzerland, seemed to be effective, and reports of that come back, and then from 1936 onwards, it's used in the UK and the USA. What we get are tables that detail the remissions, the partial cures, the effectiveness. But there's not really much discussion of how or why it worked. It just seemed to. And by this period, we start seeing an incredibly enthusiastic response in the USA. Sakel presents the therapy to a glittering array of American psychiatrists, including, there we have Adolf Meyer. I had a real thing against Meyer for a while, which is why I've given him evil flashing eyes. I'm not sure that I feel quite that badly about him anymore. He was a man that seemed very hard to make up his mind about things. Clearly his behaviour in the Cotton case wasn't overly cool, sitting on Phyllis Greenacre's report, not allowing action to proceed against Cotton. He seemed to be a fence-sitter of enormous proportions, on top of which had an enormous amount of patronage. But if you persuaded Adolf Meyer that something was good, then it was going to get taken up in the USA. And that was the case with insulin therapy. Smith Eli Jelliff, who was of a Freudian persuasion. He could put any sort of spin, Freudian spin, on the treatment. It works by withdrawing the libido from the outside world and fusing it with the death impulse for the maintenance of the narcissistic ego. We'll be talking about Freud a bit later on, but that might look like gobbledygook to you. It might look ridiculous to you, but at the time that had some scientific validity. Outside world and fusing it with the death impulse for the maintenance of the narcissistic ego. And it becomes, again, an established part of the asylum regime, part of that spectrum of cures. The more intractable your condition seems to be, the more likely that you will undergo this form of cure. It had significant problems. It appeared to improve recovery rates from schizophrenia, but it was monumentally time-consuming. It was a very intensive treatment. Patients had to be given small doses of insulin over many days, to be watched constantly and permitted to spend no more than 20 minutes in complete coma, and then brought around using a sugar solution. And this could be repeated over 20 times. It is incredibly dangerous because the sequelae of doing this were conditions like pneumonia that could prove to be fatal in an era when there are limited amounts of treatment for that particular condition. And it could take upwards of 10 days. Think of the nursing staff, the time of the physician in carrying this out. So it did have certain drawbacks. Moving swiftly on to one of my favourites, Wagner Jaureg's radical treatment for general paralysis of the insane. You'll remember that general paralysis of the insane is the tertiary stage of syphilis, when insanity seems to be the result, a kind of dementia that has resulted from syphilis being allowed to run its course. And if you suffered from GPI, generally the place that you ended up was in an asylum. And clearly they wanted to ameliorate these kind of conditions. Oh, there we go. Got me a mosquito going. Wagner Jaureg, interesting character, not particularly pleasant, becomes a Nazi. He speculates that because of the brain activity that goes on in psychosis, that fever might be used to mitigate the symptoms of many of the psychoses. He starts out looking for materials that he can use to achieve this. He takes Robert Koch's failed cure for tuberculosis, tuberculin, and puts it into patients because it's been noted the one thing that tuberculin does is raise people's temperatures and poisons them, basically. He tries this, but it's so dangerous, so toxic, that he has to search for another solution of creating artificial fever. He's working in Serbia, that's tuberculin. He's working in Serbia during 1917, during the First World War, and he admits a shell-shock malarial sufferer into his clinic. And he thinks, malaria, that will do the trick. I can infect my GPI patients with malaria because they sure as hell will get fever from that malaria and it will mitigate their symptoms. And the good thing about it was that we can control the fever when we want to using quinine. So he went ahead and did that. Used the blood of the malarial patient in schizophrenia, infected them with fever, and watched the results. And hey presto, it did seem to work. Or work in the extent, there we go, work to the extent, I'm going to get rid of that mosquito next year, it's really annoying me. So controlled by quinine. And this is the typical trajectory of this story, wins the Nobel Prize for it because it seems to be so effective. And the reason it goes out of the window is a few years later, penicillin does a lot better job of controlling syphilis. It comes along and can be used as a cure. But again, notice that speculation, the desperation followed by the speculation, followed by, right, we're just going to bring this treatment in, give it a go. This is the clinical method in action. Gradually working our way towards the shock treatments. Shock treatment, as it was first used, what becomes ECT, was actually done on a chemical basis. This guy, Ladislav Meduna, in 1926, notices what he believes is a difference in the structure of the brains of epileptics and schizophrenics at autopsy. And so, bang! Epilepsy and schizophrenia cannot coexist in the same brain. So maybe, if we can give a schizophrenic an epileptic attack, induce an epileptic attack, then maybe we can ameliorate the symptoms of schizophrenia. So he goes around searching for a drug that will allow him to induce a fit in patients. And he comes up, I'm running out of time, so I have to go over this quickly. He comes up with using this drug based upon camphor called cardiazol. Deeply unpleasant when it's given to patients. It causes nausea, it causes fear, it also causes the fits. And again, notice we've got the same thing, 50% remission using this particular method. As I say, cardiazol has enormous problems, not least of which the patients were monumentally terrified of it. They would fight, run away, try and prevent themselves from being drugged with it. The fits were excessively violent, required nurses to pin the patient down to avoid severe injury. And later on, curare was used as a relaxant before actually giving this, obviously in limited dosing. And it was very hard to actually dose this properly. On the same rationale, electroconvulsive therapy soon replaced it. It appeared to be more effective and less traumatic. And it's perhaps for that reason that Meduna did not win a Nobel Prize. But he did get a chair in psychiatry at Chicago, where he then went on to experiment with carbon dioxide therapy. I haven't gone on into that. It doesn't sound very nice. We rapidly move on to shock treatment. The use of electricity, high voltage jolts through the brain on the same rationale as cardiazol was being used. Here we go, Eddie Shorter. I don't know why he's been animated like this. Eddie Shorter proves to be a bit of a fan. We don't know why it works, we don't know how it works, but we know in certain cases of depression it does work. Well, remember that initially this wasn't being used for certain cases of depression. It was aimed mainly at schizophrenia. What it has actually evolved into today is something significantly different. The man that was responsible for developing this particular form of cure was Ugo Ciletti. He explores lesions in epilepsy by experimenting on dogs. He initially shocks dogs to see whether he can induce epileptic fits. He puts one electrode in the mouth, one up the bum. This was never going to work on human beings, and basically kills them. He's experimenting all the time, trying to work out what dosage won't result in killing individuals. And he assembles a crack team to explore physical approaches to schizophrenia, including shock. He discovers that electrodes attached to dogs' temples were safer, and then he moves on to stunning pigs in abattoirs so that he can calculate a self-dosage and constructs the first primitive ECT apparatus. Interestingly, and of course this is fascist Italy, so this kind of thing was always going to be okay, they find a derelict on the street and decide that this is the ideal guy to get the first course of shock therapy. Drag this disorientated man in from the police in Rome on the 15th of April 1938 and give him shocks. ECT ameliorated the first patient's symptoms for a while. Problems had to be ironed out. Again, there was the issue of self-injury. Again, curare was the solution. I believe that Freeman was responsible for that idea. And then safer chemical methods. Dosages had to be worked out. For some reason, psychoanalysts were more resistant to it than to lobotomy. But in the US, UK and Europe, it spread through the asylums like wildfire, becoming the mainstay of psychiatric treatment. There we go. Come on. Without ECT, I would not have lasted in psychiatry, as I would not have been able to tolerate the sadness and hopelessness of most mental illnesses before the introduction of convulsive therapy. That's the testimony of one psychiatrist. Shorter, there with the beer at the lectern, makes me quite like him, that picture, actually. He felt that it was a milestone because it broke psychiatry free from neurology. Others felt that the issue was more that at least it gave psychiatrists something to do. One may question whether shock treatments do any good to the patients, but there can be no doubt that they have done an enormous amount of good to psychiatry. Now we'll see over the coming lectures how increasingly there is a reaction against these forms of therapies, particularly during the 1960s and the general revolt against psychiatry.